Hey guys, this is Retro Raven, and today we're going to look at something that is kind of the history of video games pixel art. Now, a lot of people, when they think of pixel art, at least nowadays, they think of things like Minecraft or maybe Terraria, but something that people really do think about when they think of pixel art is they think of old video game consoles. Like, the Nintendo Entertainment System or the Atari 2600. But you could also be thinking about arcade systems too, because technically they were all basically the same thing. Arcade systems were just big game systems that had a built-in TV, and they weren't really standard. Like, you got one game on them, and then that was it, and then you had to make a whole new system for a whole different game. Well, anyway, because graphics displays were the way they were, you had to work with individual pixels for the graphics. I mean, this is all, standard stuff that everyone knows. Well, anyway, when it comes to pixel art, the whole thing is the historical reason of why people used pixels was not because they were going for an artistic effect, which is what the reasoning is nowadays, but it's because that's what they had. That is all they had. So basically, it was like you had pixel graphics or you had nothing. Some people would say there were different art styles when it comes to the methodology of placing the pixels. I like to just think that the art style was pixels, at least in the early days. There didn't really emerge any art styles until you went from the 8-bit era into the 16-bit era. And then you had slightly higher resolutions, you had a larger color palette, you had far more options as far as that goes. And so then it got to the point where instead of being constrained by the technical limitations, you put the constraints on yourself so that the art had a certain look to it. The best way to think of this is to think of the difference between Earthworm Jim and Mortal Kombat. The games look completely different, but they're still technically pixel art. On top of that, you can look at Mortal Kombat and that looks one way, and then you can look at Street Fighter and that looks a different way. But not only games like that, you also get other sorts of pixel style things. Because pixels kind of had to do everything back then. Whereas nowadays, we use a combination of many different kinds of art renderings. I'm not sure if renderings is the correct word, but I'm using that as a means of saying that, like, with raster graphics, there are pixels that are a absolute size of an absolute color of an absolute shape. With vector graphics, you have an absolute color of a relative place, of a relative shape, of a relative size. Now, what this means is with raster graphics, when you zoom in past 100%, they get pixelated, as we call it. What this means is that there's no information there anymore. You're zooming in, and it's just enlarging the information that's already there, but there's nothing else to it. Now you can zoom out from them just fine, and you're losing information because it has to interpolate there. That's the whole thing with raster graphics. Now vector graphics, on the other hand, there is no 100%. There's just whatever size they are rendered to. But if you have the original vector file, then you can zoom in on it infinitely, and there's a point where you lose detail because the detail has not been placed there, but there's no absolute size. The size is anything that it wants to be. It can be as large as you want it. And this is how a lot of modern games are made. They're made with vector graphics because they will display on any screen size and any resolution. They will all look relatively the same. Whereas if you have raster graphics, if they're displayed too large, then they look bad. And if they're displayed too small, then they don't interpolate correctly. But back in the day, you only had pixels, so everything had to be pixels. This means that, like, another game from the same era as Mortal Kombat and Earthworm Jim and all those is Star Fox. And I'm not talking about Star Fox 64, I'm talking about Star Fox for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And also the sequel that was never released, but which we have the ROMs for, Star Fox 2. A lot of people think that game is 3D, and it is. It's 2.5D. It's not 3D, it's 2.5D. So if you round it up, then it is 3D. But no, it's not, because there's no 3D models. They're all just pixels that are displayed that way. we can know this because you can rip the files, and that's what the files are. They're all just still images. Basically, it was 3D done the same way that the NES did it. There are a couple games that are 3D, or 2.5D for the NES. And it's also how a lot of arcade games did it. They're not actually 3D, it's just the game engine is using some tricks to make everything look like it's 3D. But really, it's just a bunch of pictures of probably what were 3D models, but they're just rendered in every different possible angle they can be. So, it's not 3D, it's still pixel art. And this is the thing with pixels. They were basically the universal art. They could do anything because they had to do everything. There really wasn't much in the way of options except for doing vector graphics, and you couldn't do pixels and vectors at the same time, or you could, but not really. Now, vector graphics at the time were very, very primitive because, think about it, you have to render lines in real time, whereas with pixels it was all pre-calculated for you. All you had to do was move them. It's more technical than that, but that's the extremely basic way to think of it. Now, when things did get more advanced and we started getting 3D graphics that were proper 3D, for example, the remake of Star Fox SNES, which is Star Fox 64. And I'm saying remake because that's actually what it is. It's just a remake, it's not a sequel. You still have pixel graphics, but it's Mortal Kombat style pixel graphics. And what I'm talking about is I'm talking about whenever you get one of your team members popping up on the screen and they're like, "Hey Einstein, I'm on your side." Then, that is still pixel graphics. And I say Mortal Kombat style because it's a scan of a real world image. I believe it's claymation for Star Fox 64, whereas with Mortal Kombat it was real people. The thing is there, you had the pixel graphics overlaid on top of the 3D graphics, which the 3D graphics consisted of, well, all 3D graphics, they consist of a model with a texture on top. Sometimes the texture is optional, like in Sub Rosa, which is a modern game. I can't think of any retro games that didn't have textures on their stuff, unless you glitched the game. For the most part, everything had some kind of texture. Now, in a more modern sense, you'll have other stuff on top of textures. Like, you won't have a texture, you'll have a diffuse map, and then you'll have a specularity map, a normal map, a displacement map, height map, all sorts of different things. Sometimes not all of them, but you'll have some kind of combination of them, or something along those lines. Like, that's all fine and dandy, but I'm talking about classic things where it was just, you had the model and the texture, and that's it. And the texture is obviously made of pixels, so if you get up on it, then it gets pixelated. Usually it'll have some kind of pixel filter on it. I am not sure of what all systems had pixel filters, but I believe the Nintendo 64 had a filter, so if you got up on something, then it was kind of blurred. The contrast to this is obviously the original PlayStation. It did not have texture filtering, so if you got up on something, you saw the individual pixels. It's just stuff like that. Now, if you're playing a PlayStation 1 game on your PlayStation 2, and you can turn on texture filtering, and you'll see the difference, like right there. You can turn texture filtering on and off, and you'll see the difference. Especially considering if you play it on a PlayStation 2, then you can turn the internal resolution up to 2 times the original size. Because the original PlayStation, I'm going to use YouTube terms here, but it's just so that everyone understands. The original PlayStation rendered games in 240p, and the PlayStation 2 rendered games in 480p. So, there you go. Some PlayStation 2 games could go up to 1080p, but that's not the focus of this video, so just ignore that. Now, pixel art has always been in games. Like, there's not a point where it stopped being in games. Because, just think about the Game Boy, okay? Obviously, they had to have pixels there. And then we got Game Boy Color, still pixels. Game Boy Advance, still pixels. Now you could do extra stuff with the pixels, but you get what I'm saying. And then we get the DS. Now you can do 3D stuff, but you still have a lot of pixels, because pixels are just always going to be there. You could do a lot more effects with the pixels with the Game Boy Advance, but it wasn't until the DS that you could actually do 3D. But you still had a ton of games that still had, your classic pixel art. because I don't think the DS could do vector stuff. Now, even look at the 3DS. The 3DS and the new 3DS. Those systems are much more sophisticated with their 3D graphics, but they still have pixel art. They still have pixel games, all that stuff. They just do some special stuff with them. The thing is, those games are not trying to evoke the feelings of old games. And I bring this up because a lot of the reason why we still have pixel art in some games is not because it's necessary or not because they're going for a certain style. It's because they are trying to make their game look retro to appeal to nostalgia. I am kind of on the fence with this because I like the idea of appealing to people's nostalgia, but it bothers me when a game is made solely to profit off of nostalgia. That's my problem. See, there is appealing to nostalgia to evoke a feeling, an emotion, to inform, to do any sorts of things like that, and then there's putting something into your game for money. Now, I understand that people who make games, they're not making games just because they want to. That may be a big motivation, and of course that's going to be what they're going to tell you. They're going to tell you, oh no, we're all about making games. But at the end of the day, they need to make money. And the best way to make money is to make people think that you don't want to make money. And this is just a standard thing of life. This isn't me pointing out, this isn't me trying to tell any political message or anything like that. It's the way things are. People want to make money, but the best way to make money is to tell you that they don't want to make money. Because if you tell people straight up, I want your money, they're going to find every way they can to not give you their money. So this is where we get a lot of games like Shovel Knight, and I'm not saying Shovel Knight is bad, I'm saying games like Shovel Knight. Understand that. I am not dissing Shovel Knight. I am not shoveling some crap onto Shovel Knight. I'm just stating, the faux retro games. Or retro if you put the funny French at the end of it. You get the idea. The whole idea is they are trying to basically make a game that could have been on one of the old systems. I've seen a lot of games that do this. They're like, we're making a game that could be on an NES. And then I see it, and I can tell you why their game would not be on an NES. Because, if they tell you they want to make a game that looks like it's an NES game, but then you look at it, and it's not the exact correct NES resolution, it has not NES colors, because the NES has a very specific palette. There are very, 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 very specific colors that the NES can display, and it cannot display anything else. So if someone makes a game and it has one color that is not on that palette, that game could not be on an NES, and that's the problem. Because if you care about your game being authentic, then that's one thing. But then there's saying things because you're trying to mislead people, and that's what bothers me. I see a lot of this misleading sort of business, and it's somewhat disturbing because these games sell very, very well, and they shouldn't. Not because they're bad games, but because they're being dishonest. And it bothers me. And not only being dishonest, but I just see games that are blatantly trying to just look old because people who grew up with that stuff, they're blinded by the nostalgia and they're just gonna buy it the first chance they get because fuck it, it's $10. I'll go ahead and buy it. Now, there's games that you would think I would hate because of that, but I don't, and I'll explain this. Let's look at Minecraft. Minecraft is not trying to appeal to nostalgia. And this isn't because I'm a Minecraft fanboy. I think Minecraft is kind of stupid, and I don't like the fact that it runs terribly, mostly because it was made in Java. If you look at its graphics, it's not trying to be retro. It's just pixelated because that was the easiest graphics to make. That's not trying to be dishonest, that's just pragmatism. More than anything else, that's just pragmatism. And it can be whatever graphics you want it to be. You can upload high-resolution textures on there. You can put all sorts of 3D effects on there now. You can do whatever the hell you want to do. You can animate them. It's 3D. It's not fooling anybody. It's not trying to look retro. If it is, that's more a side effect than their main goal. But then you get games like Terraria, and this is the other game that I mentioned earlier. Then you get games like Terraria, and they are trying to look retro. And they're failing at it because it doesn't look retro. It has too many effects. It looks too good. It has parallax effects. You'd never see those in a 3D game. You'd never see those in a retro game. It has all sorts of like tilting stuff. It has particle effects. It has layer effects. It has colors that would not exist on an old system, but it's clearly trying to emulate the old Japanese RPG style. And it's not even emulating that because that's not what old Japanese RPGs looked like. I mean, if you look at Legend of Zelda, which would be an old game that it could feasibly be trying to emulate, it has less colors. It actually is an RPG. Whereas Terraria, it's trying to be an RPG in some respects, but at the same time, it's also trying to be a Minecraft clone. But it's not really trying to be that either because there's no sandbox mode. So it's also trying to be somewhat like a collaborative. It's trying to be like a collaborative game about breaking blocks. It's not even a proper sandbox game. It's not really anything. It's just, it has pixels on it, so people liked it for a time. And it wasn't until the developers turned out to be douchebags that people stopped liking it. And then you get other games like, let's look at Starbound. It's basically Terraria. It's Terraria in space. But then you get good modern pixel style things where you get games like now this is also going to be surprising, for me to say. RPG Maker. Okay, so we got all these editions of RPG Maker, and a lot of people know RPG Maker for, the crappy games that you see YouTubers playing or whatever. Or at least that's what it used to be known for a couple years back. I'm not sure if that's still the trend. But if you think about it, it's just a creation tool. It's not trying to look old. And the thing is, even if it was trying to look old, it actually has the heritage to support that. If you want to have an old-looking game, you can go get the RPG Maker from 12 years ago and go use that. If you're trying to make a game that looks modern, but happens to have the pixel style, such as a game that would actually be playable on a DS, then there you go. It allows for many different kinds of games, and it just happens to have pixels. The pixels were not shoehorned into the games to make them popular. It just happens to have them. That's really the thing that I think is good about pixel games. When a pixel game is made with the intent of having pixels, that's what bothers me. Because that's not how pixels were traditionally used. When a game happens to have pixels, that's when I think it's good, because that's an art style. It's just like, you don't go out of your way to like something because it's an anime. Like, are you going to pick the anime that is going to have the ridiculous characters that act very, 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 very cliched, the dumb plot that practically doesn't need to exist, the ridiculous panty shots every chance you get, all the fan service, all this ridiculous stuff with the horribly cliched sounding soundtrack, and it's got all these like ridiculous collector's edition box set stuff, like you get a fucking body pillow. Are you gonna go for that anime, or are you gonna go for something that's a good story that just happens to be an anime? It's not that either choice is wrong. It's just that the anime that is trying too hard, it comes off as very, very trashy, whereas the anime that just happens to be an anime, that is actually good, and that is the kind of stuff that anybody can enjoy. That's where the whole issue comes from. It's not that I have a problem with games because they have pixels. I have a problem with games that disrespect the pixels and turn the pixels into a freak show circus attraction. That's the whole point I've basically been trying to make. Pixels should not be something where you just look at them and you say like,
"Oh, look at me! I have pixels! I have so many pixels! There's all these pixels! They're square, they have hard edges! It's pixels!"
They should be something that you look at and you appreciate because it is an art style. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people don't understand. Pixels, it's just another art style. It's not something to be deified, glorified, whatever. And I think that if you try to put pixels up on a pedestal like that as the ultimate thing that should be definitely the entire game should revolve around, I think that is misusing pixels. So, I know that was kind of rambly. I hope that makes sense. I was going to do a follow up on retro games that aren't retro, but I think I kind of covered it here, so I'm just going to make this kind of a compound video. It's kind of weird because this is the first video of this series, but you get what I'm saying. So anyway, I think that's going to do it for this. It's been Retro Raven. See you later. Da, 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 da. Ugh.